Her husband died. Their house was taken away. Among her old belongings, she found a letter. The address led to a house in a remote forest and a strange corridor inside. Subscribe to the channel. Write in the comments which city you are watching from. The morning Michael Carter died began like any other, quiet in the careful way that life sometimes becomes when it feels temporarily stable. Emily remembered the light first. It slipped through the kitchen window at an angle she had always associated with ordinary days, days that did not announce themselves as important until long after they had passed. The coffee maker hummed. Nathan sat at the table with his school backpack at his feet, swinging one leg as he ate cereal and talked about something trivial, a project involving cardboard and glue that required parental signatures and a promise to buy supplies over the weekend. Michael stood by the counter, sleeves rolled up, reading something on his phone with the distracted focus of a man already halfway into the workday. He smiled at Emily without looking at her, a small, reflexive smile that had become part of their shared rhythm. It was the kind of moment people forget to notice because it seems repeatable, because it feels safe. He left 10 minutes later, kissed Nathan's hair, pressed his forehead briefly against Emily's temple, and said he would be home late. He always said that. Emily watched him walk down the driveway, watched the car disappear between the houses, and then turned back inside to rinse a bowl, unaware that she had just stepped into the longest silence of her life. The call came before noon, a number she didn't recognize, a voice that spoke too carefully, as if every word had been rehearsed and weighed. There had been an emergency. Michael had collapsed at work. They had tried. They were sorry. The words slid past Emily without attaching themselves to meaning. She asked questions she did not remember later. She answered questions she did not understand. She sat down on the kitchen floor because standing suddenly seemed impossible, and the tiles felt cold and oddly solid beneath her palms. Nathan came home that afternoon to a house that felt wrong before anything was said. Children noticed absence before explanation. He stood in the doorway, backpack still on, and looked at his mother with a seriousness that did not belong to an 8-year-old. Emily told him that his father wasn't coming home, not today, not ever again. She told him in a voice that sounded like someone else's, flat and careful, as if emotion were something dangerous that might explode if mishandled. Nathan did not cry. He nodded once, slowly, and went to his room. Emily heard him close the door. That quiet click became a sound she would remember for years, because it was the moment she realized that grief did not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it arrived as restraint, as an effort to be brave that hurt more than any scream. The days that followed blurred together in a sequence of tasks that felt unreal in their precision. Hospital paperwork, funeral arrangements, phone calls that began with silence and ended with apologies. People brought food. They hugged her too tightly or not enough. They said Michael's name in the past tense and then corrected themselves, as if grammar could reverse reality. Emily moved through it all with a sense of distance, as though she were watching another woman perform the rituals of loss. At night, when the house was quiet and Nathan slept, she lay awake and listened to the familiar sounds of their home, the ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional groan of pipes. These sounds had once been background noise. Now they felt accusatory, reminders that the world continued unchanged while her own life had fractured. When the funeral ended and the last casserole dish was returned, the practical consequences of Michael's absence began to surface with relentless clarity. Emily discovered that grief had an administrative side, one that demanded attention even when the heart was unwilling. Medical bills arrived first, thick envelopes stamped with urgency. Then letters from the bank, polite but firm, outlining missed payments and future expectations. Michael's life insurance covered some costs, But not enough. It was never enough. Emily took on extra shifts. She worked evenings after Nathan went to bed, and weekends when she could find someone to watch him. She told herself it was temporary, that she only needed to bridge the gap until things stabilized. But stabilization never came. Every month, the balance dipped lower. Every decision required calculation. She learned the price of groceries by heart and developed the habit of putting items back on shelves without looking disappointed. The house, once a symbol of safety, became a source of anxiety. Emily stopped noticing its comforts and began seeing only its vulnerabilities. The aging roof, the outdated furnace, the mortgage statement that arrived with relentless regularity, indifferent to circumstance. When the bank finally called, not to warn but to inform, Emily felt a strange sense of relief beneath the panic. At least the waiting was over. At least the uncertainty had resolved into something definitive, even if that something was loss. They moved out in early fall, when the leaves had just begun to turn, and the air carried a sharpness that hinted at colder days ahead. The new place was smaller, dimmer, and smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals. Emily told Nathan it was an adventure, a fresh start. He accepted the explanation with the quiet seriousness he had adopted since his father's death. He no longer asked when things would go back to normal. He seemed to understand, in his own way, that normal was gone. The loss of the house marked something deeper than a change of address. It was the moment Emily realized she was no longer recovering. She was surviving, and the difference mattered. Recovery implied a return to something recognizable. Survival meant adaptation without guarantees. Nathan changed, too. He began watching Emily with an attentiveness that made her uncomfortable. He noticed when she skipped meals. He noticed when she sat too long at the table, staring at unpaid bills. He learned to be quiet, to occupy himself without being asked. Emily hated that most of all. Childhood, she believed, should be noisy and demanding. Silence belonged to adults. One evening, months after Michael's death, Emily reached a point she could not immediately name, but would later recognize as a breaking point. She had worked a double shift. Nathan had fallen asleep on the couch with a book open on his chest. The apartment was dark, except for the kitchen light, and the air felt heavy with exhaustion. Emily stood there, keys still in her hand, and realized she no longer knew what she was working toward. The effort felt endless, the outcome uncertain. That night, after carrying Nathan to bed, she opened the closet where Michael's remaining belongings were stored. She had avoided it until then, treating the boxes like something fragile and dangerous. But avoidance had not improved anything. If anything, it had made the silence heavier. She pulled the boxes down one by one and sat on the floor, sorting through their contents. Old manuals, receipts, notes scribbled in Michael's handwriting, reminders about things he never had time to finish. The smell of dust and paper filled the small room. Emily worked slowly, deliberately, letting memory surface without resistance. At the bottom of the last box, she found a folder that did not belong with the others. It was thinner, the paper inside yellowed with age. Tucked between insurance forms and legal documents was an envelope, unmarked, except for her name written in a careful, unfamiliar hand. Emily stared at it for a long moment before opening it. Something about its presence felt deliberate, as though it had been waiting for this exact moment, for her to be tired enough, desperate enough, to notice it. Outside the closet, the apartment was silent. Nathan slept. The world held its breath. Emily slid the letter from the envelope and unfolded it. The paper crackled softly, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. She had no idea yet that this letter would change the direction of her life, that it would pull her and her son toward a place Michael had known but never shared. All she knew was that, for the first time in months, something unexpected had entered her grief, and silence, which had defined her days for so long, was about to be broken. Emily read the letter once without understanding it, then again more slowly, allowing each sentence to settle. The handwriting was steady but old-fashioned, the kind that suggested a man who valued clarity over speed. There was no greeting beyond her name, no apology for intrusion, no explanation for the delay. The letter assumed it would be found eventually, not opened in panic or hope, but discovered at the precise moment when it was needed. It began with a simple statement of fact. The writer introduced himself as Henry Carter, Michael's grandfather, and noted the year he was writing as if time itself mattered. He wrote that he lived far from towns, far from people, and that he had chosen that distance deliberately. He did not explain why. He did not justify it. He simply stated it, the way one might state the weather or the direction of the wind. As Emily read, she felt a strange sense of intrusion, as though she were stepping into a conversation that had never been meant for her alone. Henry wrote about the land first, a small parcel near the edge of the state, bordered by forest and cut by a narrow creek. He described the winters in careful detail, not with drama, but with precision. The cold was not the problem, he wrote. The wind was. The distance between structures was. The simple act of moving from one place to another could become fatal if left unprotected. Then he wrote about his work, the house, the workshop, the storage shed. The decision to raise a covered passage between them, elevated above the snow, slatted to let the air move without inviting the storm inside. He wrote about learning from old bridges he had seen as a boy, structures built not for beauty, but for survival. He wrote about mistakes, revisions, improvements, about building not for comfort, but for continuity. Emily paused, the letter resting loosely in her hands. Michael had never spoken of his grandfather in any detail. She knew he had existed, that he had lived out there somewhere, as Michael once put it, but nothing more. This letter revealed a man who thought deeply about survival, about preparation, about the quiet mathematics of staying alive. The next paragraph shifted in tone. Henry wrote about Michael. He mentioned visits, short ones, quiet ones. He wrote that Michael understood the ideas, the reasons behind them, but carried a different kind of weight. Michael worried about isolation, about raising a family away from schools and hospitals, about asking others to share a life that required constant vigilance. Henry did not criticize him for that. He wrote that fear was not weakness, only caution. Emily felt her throat tighten. She remembered Michael's unexplained trips, the way he would pack lightly and leave early, returning tired but calm, as if something had settled inside him. She had assumed it was work, or perhaps grief of his own that he did not wish to share. Now the pieces began to align into a shape she had never considered. The letter ended with a request, not a demand. Henry wrote that if the letter was being read, then circumstances had likely become difficult. He acknowledged that the land was not easy, that the work was hard, and that the project remained unfinished. He wrote that he had left what he could, not wealth, but the bones of a solution. He asked that whoever stood in his place finish what he had begun, not for pride, not for legacy, but for safety. Emily lowered the letter and sat back against the wall. The closet felt smaller, the air heavier. She was aware of her own breathing, of the ache in her shoulders, of the exhaustion that had become her constant companion. Anger rose first, sharp and sudden. Anger at Henry for placing this burden on her without consent. Anger at Michael for knowing and saying nothing. Anger at the quiet assumption that she would be strong enough to carry something that had broken others. She read the letter again, searching for any hint of deception, any exaggeration. But the tone remained consistent. There was no promise of ease, no guarantee of success, only an offer of possibility. Nathan appeared in the doorway while she was reading it a third time. He stood there silently, watching her with the same careful attention he had developed since his father's death. Emily noticed the way his eyes went to the paper in her hands, the way his posture shifted, as if he sensed its importance. "What is it?" he asked. Emily hesitated, then held the letter out to him. He did not take it immediately. Instead, he sat beside her on the floor, close enough that she could feel his warmth. She began to read it aloud, simplifying some of the language, skipping over parts that would not make sense to him yet. When she mentioned the house in the forest, Nathan looked up sharply. "Dad took me there once," he said. Emily stopped reading. "What?" Nathan frowned, searching his memory. "Not inside. We didn't stay long. It was cold. He said it was Grandpa's place. He told me not to tell you, because it would only worry you." The words settled between them, heavy but clarifying. Emily felt something shift inside her, not relief, but understanding. Michael had not hidden the place out of indifference. He had hidden it out of caution, perhaps even out of love. That night, after Nathan went to bed, Emily lay awake again. But this time, the silence felt different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with questions. She thought about the apartment, about the months ahead, about the slow erosion of stability she had been experiencing. She thought about the land described in the letter, about the work required, about the isolation she feared. Fear argued loudly. The distance, the lack of support, the responsibility of placing her child in an environment she could not fully control. Fear reminded her that survival wasn't the same as living. But another voice emerged, quieter but persistent. It pointed out that what she was doing now was also a risk, just one that felt familiar. It reminded her that she had already lost everything that tied her to her previous life. What remained was obligation and effort, without direction. In the following days, Emily researched quietly. She looked up property records, tracing ownership back decades. The land existed. It had not been sold. It had simply been forgotten. She found old satellite images, blurred and outdated, but enough to confirm the structures Henry described. She read about the region's climate, about the winters, about the nearest town, hours away. Nathan watched her with curiosity rather than fear. He asked practical questions. Would there be snow? Would he still be able to go to school? Would they have electricity? Emily answered honestly when she could, and admitted uncertainty when she could not. She noticed that he seemed less afraid of the unknown than she was. The decision did not arrive as a dramatic moment. There was no single realization, no triumphant declaration. Instead, it formed gradually, the way ice forms on still water. One thought reinforcing another until movement became impossible without breaking something. Emily packed what little they had left, selling what she could, donating what she could not carry. She did not tell many people where they were going. Explaining it felt impossible. How did one describe a choice that existed only because every other option had failed? On the morning they left, Emily stood in the empty apartment and looked around one last time. The walls were bare. The rooms echoed. She felt no nostalgia, only a quiet resolve. The letter rested in her bag, folded and worn from rereading. As they drove away, the city thinning behind them, Emily realized that the letter had not offered rescue. It had offered responsibility. It had placed a decision in her hands and trusted her to act. And she was acting now, carrying her son toward a place that had waited in silence for years, toward a story that had begun long before she knew it existed. The road narrowed long before it disappeared. Pavement gave way to cracked asphalt, then to gravel that shifted under the tires with a restless sound that made Emily instinctively tighten her grip on the steering wheel. The GPS signal faded in and out. then vanished entirely, leaving behind a blue dot suspended in blank space. Emily turned it off and relied instead on the printed directions she had copied from county records, a sequence of turns that felt less like navigation and more like instruction for leaving the known world behind. Nathan watched the landscape change with open curiosity. Towns thinned, then stopped altogether. Gas stations became rare, then non-existent. Forest pressed closer to the road, dense and indifferent, trees standing so close together that sunlight filtered through them in narrow shafts. The air felt colder, even with the windows closed, as if the land itself held on to winter longer than it should. They drove for hours without seeing another car. Emily became acutely aware of the sound of the engine, of every vibration, every unfamiliar rattle. She had the irrational sense that if the car failed here, there would be no immediate rescue, no passing stranger to help. The thought sharpened her focus. She drove carefully, deliberately, as though precision alone might keep them safe. When they finally reached the turnoff, it was marked by nothing more than a weathered wooden post, leaning at an angle, the paint long gone. The road beyond it was little more than a track, narrow and uneven, winding deeper into the forest. Emily hesitated only briefly before turning. There was no alternative route. There rarely was. The house revealed itself gradually. First the roofline, barely visible through the trees, then the shape of the walls, dark against the snow-dusted ground. It did not look abandoned, so much as paused, as if someone had simply stepped away and never returned. The forest had begun to reclaim it, but cautiously, respecting the boundaries it had been given. Emily parked in a small clearing and turned off the engine. The sudden quiet was startling. No distant traffic, no human noise at all. Only the wind moving through branches and the faint sound of the creek Henry had mentioned in his letter. Nathan climbed out of the car and stood still, taking it all in. His breath formed small clouds in the cold air. The house was smaller than Emily had imagined, but sturdier. Thick wooden walls, well fitted despite their age. The windows were intact, their glass dulled, but unbroken. The door opened with effort, the hinges stiff but functional. Inside, the air smelled of wood, dust, and something faintly metallic. It smelled like work, like effort preserved. Emily walked through the room slowly, touching surfaces as if confirming their reality. A table scarred by years of use, shelves built into the walls, sturdy and practical, a wood stove in the center of the main room, its iron surface cold but solid. This was not a place built for comfort. It was built to endure. Beyond the house stood the workshop, larger than Emily expected. Its doors were heavy, reinforced, designed to keep out both cold and animals. Inside, tools hung neatly along the walls, arranged with a care that spoke of habit rather than obsession. Workbenches bore marks of repeated use. This was where Henry had spent his days, shaping solutions from raw material. Between the house and the workshop stood the thing that immediately drew Emily's attention. The beginning of the passage. Posts sunk into the ground, rising higher than necessary, their tops capped but unfinished. Beams laid out, some secured, others waiting. The skeletal form of a roof that had never been completed. It looked neither fragile nor complete, but suspended between intention and abandonment. Nathan approached it cautiously, looking up at the structure with a seriousness that mirrored his mother's. "This is what Dad talked about," he said quietly. "The bridge." Emily nodded. She could see it now, the logic Henry had described. Raised above the ground to avoid drifting snow, positioned carefully to account for wind. Not decorative, not excessive, simply functional. It was incomplete, but the idea was unmistakable. They spent the first afternoon exploring and assessing. Emily found the root cellar Henry had mentioned, its door partially hidden beneath a layer of fallen leaves and snow. Inside, the air was cold and damp, but not frozen. Crates of potatoes, shriveled but usable. Onions. Jars of preserved vegetables, their labels handwritten and faded. Enough to survive on, at least for a while. That night, they slept in the house, bundled in coats and blankets. The stove took effort to light, but once it did, the warmth spread slowly, unevenly, but persistently. Emily lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest, every crack and rustle amplified by unfamiliarity. Nathan slept more easily than she did, exhaustion winning out over uncertainty. In the days that followed, routine began to form out of necessity. Emily inventoried supplies, food first, then fuel, then tools. She found a stack of firewood under a lean-to, protected from snow, carefully split and stacked. Henry had planned ahead. She realized that repeatedly, each discovery reinforcing the sense that this place had been prepared, not just for survival, but for continuity. Nathan made himself useful without being asked. He gathered small branches for kindling, fetched water from the creek, learned quickly how to move carefully across uneven ground. Emily watched him with a mixture of pride and sorrow. He was too young to be doing this, but he did it anyway, adapting in the quiet way children often do when they sense necessity. The cold deepened as the days passed. Winter arrived early in the forest, without ceremony. The nights grew longer. Frost settled on every surface by morning. Emily understood now why Henry had been so precise in his descriptions. Distance mattered here. Exposure mattered. Even the short walk between the house and the workshop felt longer in the wind, more dangerous when the ground iced over. She began to study the drawings Henry had left behind. They were detailed but not rigid, more guidance than prescription. Measurements adjusted to terrain, notes in the margins about wind direction, snow accumulation, airflow. He had built with the land, not against it. Emily traced the lines with her finger, imagining the finished passage, the protection it would offer. Work began slowly. Emily was not a builder by training, but she was not inexperienced. Michael had taught her basics over the years, small repairs, practical skills. Here, those lessons became foundation. She worked carefully, double-checking each placement, each connection. Mistakes here would not be inconvenient. They would be dangerous. Nathan assisted where he could, handing her tools, holding boards steady, asking questions that forced her to articulate what she was doing and why. In explaining, she found understanding. The work grounded her. Each completed task felt like progress, not just toward a structure, but toward stability. Yet the house did not welcome them with comfort. It did not soften its demands because of their circumstances. Pipes froze. Wind found its way through unseen gaps. Emily learned quickly that this place would not forgive neglect or assumption. It required attention, effort, respect. At night, when exhaustion pressed heavy against her bones, Emily sat by the fire and thought about Michael, about how he must have stood in this same room, weighed these same decisions, and chosen to walk away for the sake of safety. She did not resent him for it. She understood him better now. But understanding did not ease the burden. The house had not waited for them. It had remained exactly what it was, unfinished, uncompromising, indifferent to their loss. It offered no welcome, no reassurance. Only the possibility that if they worked hard enough, thought carefully enough, it might one day become something more than shelter. As winter tightened its grip on the forest, Emily realized that arriving had been the easiest part. Staying would require everything they had left. Winter did not arrive all at once. It advanced in increments, testing resolve before demanding surrender. The temperature dropped a little each night, enough that Emily noticed it first in her hands. Tools felt colder, heavier. Metal burned the skin if held too long without gloves. Breath lingered in the air even indoors before the stove fully warmed the room. The forest changed its sound as well. Leaves vanished beneath snow, and with them went the soft rustle Emily had grown used to. What remained was a sharper silence, broken only by wind and the occasional crack of wood contracting in the cold. Emily measured time now by consumption. How much firewood disappeared in a day. How quickly food stores diminished. How often the generator needed fuel. Each calculation carried weight. There was no margin for error, no easy resupply. Every trip to town meant hours of driving, and money she no longer had in abundance. She postponed those trips until necessity forced her hand. The passage took shape slowly, stubbornly. Posts stood firm, sunk deep enough to resist frost heave. But the work beyond that demanded strength Emily was not sure she possessed. Some days she woke with her muscles aching so badly that even lifting a board felt like a punishment. On those mornings, she reminded herself that stopping entirely was not an option. The house did not forgive pauses, neither did winter. Nathan sensed the strain even when Emily tried to hide it. He watched her more closely now, offering help without prompting, moving quietly when she needed silence. At night, he sometimes asked questions he did not truly expect answers to. How long until spring? How much snow could fall before the roof was in danger? Whether they would be okay if the power went out completely. Emily answered honestly, but carefully, balancing truth against fear. By midwinter, the numbers no longer favored optimism. The firewood stack shrank faster than Emily had predicted. The generator sputtered unpredictably, demanding attention she could not always give. Fuel cans sat lighter with each passing week. The passage stood nearly complete, but nearly was not enough. The roof remained unfinished, the walls incomplete. Exposure lingered where protection should have been. Emily woke one morning to a sound that did not belong. The generator had stopped during the night. The house was colder than it should have been, the stove barely holding warmth. Panic rose quickly, sharp and immediate. She restarted the generator after several attempts, but the effort left her hand shaking. She stood there afterward, listening to its uneven rhythm, and felt something inside her give way. That afternoon, she drove into town for what she knew might be the last time for a while. She bought fuel, but not as much as she needed. Lumber, but not enough to finish the passage properly. She counted bills at the register twice, then again in the car, calculating what remained. The answer was not comforting. It would last a little longer. Not long enough. The return drive felt heavier. The forest seemed darker, the road less forgiving. When they arrived, Nathan helped unload supplies in silence. He watched Emily's face carefully, reading it the way children learn to read weather. That night, they argued for the first time since arriving. It began over something small, a board cut incorrectly, a tool misplaced. Fatigue sharpened words that would otherwise have remained unspoken. Emily snapped at Nathan for not listening. Nathan snapped back that he was trying. The argument escalated quickly, fueled by weeks of restraint. Nathan accused her of bringing them somewhere unsafe. Emily accused him of not understanding what was at stake. The words hung between them, raw and immediate. Nathan's voice broke. He said he was tired of losing houses. The sentence landed harder than any accusation. Emily had no answer. She turned away, the weight of failure pressing against her chest. That night, she lay awake longer than usual, listening to the wind push against the walls, imagining it finding weaknesses she had missed. The following day brought no relief. Snow fell steadily, thick and relentless. The unfinished passage creaked under the accumulating weight. Emily worked anyway, forcing herself through tasks with a mechanical determination that felt unsustainable. Her movements slowed. Mistakes crept in. She corrected them when she noticed, but doubt lingered. As evening approached, Emily realized she was avoiding something. She had been moving around the workshop all day without addressing a section of wall she knew needed attention. It was not structurally urgent, but it bothered her in a way she could not articulate. Finally, driven by a mixture of irritation and restlessness, she began clearing the shelves mounted along that wall. Behind the lowest shelf, she felt a draft that did not match the rest of the room. She paused, pressed her hand against the wood, and felt a hollow space beyond it. Her pulse quickened. She removed the shelf completely, revealing a section of paneling that did not align with the rest. The wood was older, darker, fitted more tightly. Emily hesitated only briefly before prying it loose. The panel shifted with a soft, reluctant sound, revealing a narrow doorway concealed behind it. The space beyond was small, windowless, and surprisingly dry. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, unlit but intact. The air smelled faintly of oil and old paper. Emily stood there, stunned, for several seconds before stepping inside. Her flashlight beam swept across the room, illuminating a metal box resting on a low table, several sealed envelopes, and a stack of notebooks bound with twine. Her hands trembled as she set the light down and reached for the box. Inside were neatly stacked bills, old but usable, wrapped in paper and labeled by year. Not a fortune. Not enough to change a life. But enough. Enough to buy fuel. Enough to finish the passage. Enough to endure the winter. Emily sat down on the cold floor and laughed once, sharply, the sound breaking into something dangerously close to a sob. Nathan appeared in the doorway, alarmed by the noise. He froze when he saw her sitting there, surrounded by the evidence of preparation and foresight. She showed him the notebooks last. Henry's handwriting filled the pages, calm and deliberate. Lists, calculations, notes about weather patterns and material fatigue. Near the end, a short entry stood alone. If you are reading this, then things became harder than expected. I could not leave you comfort, only time. Use it well. Emily closed the notebook slowly. The room felt warmer somehow, though nothing physical had changed. The discovery did not erase their struggles, but it altered their shape. Despair gave way to focus. Panic receded into urgency. That night, Emily slept deeply for the first time since arriving. Outside, the storm continued, indifferent to human relief. But inside, something essential had shifted. They were no longer merely enduring. They had been given a narrow window of possibility, and Emily intended to use every moment of it. The discovery of Henry's hidden room did not make the work easier, but it made it purposeful in a way it had not been before. Emily woke the next morning with the same aching muscles and the same cold air pressing against the walls. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The despair that had slowed her movements, that had crept into every decision, was replaced by a narrow, focused determination. There was now a defined amount of time, a defined set of resources, and a clear objective. The winter had not loosened its grip, but it no longer felt infinite. She spread Henry's notebooks across the work table and read them carefully, not skimming, not searching only for what she wanted to see. She treated them with the respect one gives to a voice that cannot correct itself. His notes were practical, almost terse, but they revealed a mind that had thought through failure as thoroughly as success. He had calculated snow load based on worst-case storms, not averages. He had noted prevailing wind directions month by month. He had written about moisture buildup, about wood rot, about the danger of sealing a structure too tightly in cold climates. The passage was not meant to be comfortable. It was meant to be reliable. Emily traced the sketches of the roofline again and again, The pitch was steep enough to shed snow, but low enough to resist being torn apart by wind. The floor was raised just enough to stay above the deepest drifts, while remaining close enough to the ground for structural stability. The walls were neither solid nor open, but layered, overlapping boards that broke the wind without trapping damp air. Every choice was a compromise, and every compromise was deliberate. With the money from the hidden room, Emily planned a final trip to town. It was not an impulsive journey. She wrote lists, revised them, then revised them again. Fuel came first. Lumber second. Fasteners, sealant, replacement generator parts, and a few basic supplies she had been postponing. She did not buy more than she could carry or use. Excess was a liability here. The drive felt different this time. The forest was the same, the road just as unforgiving. But Emily no longer felt as though she were running out of chances with every mile. When she returned, Nathan helped unload without needing instruction. He had seen the change in her, and it steadied him. Work resumed immediately. Emily set a strict routine, not because she enjoyed discipline, but because the winter demanded it. Mornings were for physical labor, while her strength was highest. Afternoons were for precision work, measuring, fitting, sealing. Evenings were for planning the next day and maintaining what they already had. Nathan followed the rhythm naturally, learning when to ask questions and when to simply observe. The roof went on first. Emily worked carefully, aware that mistakes here would not announce themselves gently. Each board was overlapped precisely, sealed where Henry's notes indicated, secured firmly enough to resist uplift, but not so rigidly that the structure could not flex. She climbed down repeatedly to view the angle from a distance, adjusting when intuition and geometry disagreed. The floor came next, elevated, supported by beams Henry had already set in place years before. It required less brute force and more patience. Emily checked level constantly, adjusting shims, correcting slight misalignments. The floorboards fit together tightly, forming a continuous surface that felt solid underfoot even before it was complete. Nathan walked its length once, carefully, testing it in the way children instinctively do. When it did not shift, he smiled without comment. The walls were the most complex part. Emily followed Henry's layered design, spacing boards to block direct wind while allowing air movement. She explained the logic to Nathan as she worked, partly to teach him, partly to remind herself. Trapped moisture was as dangerous as cold. The passage had to breathe. By the time the walls were finished, the structure no longer looked skeletal. It looked intentional. It stood between the house and the workshop like a statement rather than an experiment. Emily walked through it slowly the first time, listening to the sound of her footsteps on the new floor, feeling how the wind softened as it passed through the slatted sides. The storm came sooner than expected. The sky darkened in the afternoon, the light shifting abruptly from winter pale to something heavier and more ominous. The wind rose with little warning, not gusting at first, but pressing steadily, testing every surface it touched. Snow followed quickly, thick and relentless, reducing visibility to a narrow, swirling corridor. Emily did not panic. She moved deliberately, closing doors, securing loose items, checking the generator and the stove. Nathan stayed close, not clinging, but attentive. When the first heavy gust struck the side of the house, the sound carried a violence that made Emily's chest tighten despite her preparation. She opened the door to the passage and stepped inside. The difference was immediate. The wind did not disappear, but it lost its edge. The roar outside became a muted force, present but restrained. Snow pressed against the walls, filling gaps briefly before falling away. The floor remained dry beneath her boots. The roof shed the accumulating weight, the snow sliding off in heavy sheets that disappeared into the storm below. Nathan followed her, his eyes wide, his breath coming fast. They walked together from the house toward the workshop, the storm raging on either side of them, contained by design rather than resisted by strength. The passage moved slightly beneath the pressure of wind, but it held, flexing as Henry had intended. Inside the workshop, the air was calmer, warmer once the stove was lit. Emily stood there for a long moment, listening, feeling the tension leave her shoulders in stages. She had not defeated winter. She had simply given herself a way to move through it. The storm intensified overnight. Snow piled deep around the base of the passage supports, burying the ground beneath them. The wind howled without pause, driving snow sideways, battering the forest until branches cracked and fell. The generator failed once, then again, demanding attention at hours when Emily would previously have hesitated to step outside. Now she did not. She moved through the passage as needed, carrying tools, fuel, supplies, her movements efficient and unafraid. Each trip reinforced what Henry had known and what Michael had understood. Distance was not neutral here. It was dangerous unless managed. Nathan watched her with a mixture of awe and relief. He followed when he could, learning the rhythm of safe movement, the importance of preparation. He no longer asked whether they would be okay. He watched them be okay. By the third day, the storm began to weaken. The wind softened first, losing its relentless pressure. Snow continued to fall, but more gently, settling rather than attacking. When Emily finally stepped outside again, climbing down from the passage at the workshop end, the world had transformed. Drifts rose high against trees and structures, reshaping the land into unfamiliar contours. The forest bore scars of the storm, broken limbs, and bent trunks marking its passage. The house and workshop stood firm. The passage connected them, unburied, intact. Emily rested her hand against one of the support posts, feeling its solidity beneath the cold surface. She thought of Henry, working alone in this place years before, calculating, adjusting, trusting his understanding of the land more than conventional wisdom. She thought of Michael, standing here quietly, recognizing the value of what his grandfather had built and the risk of asking others to share it. She understood them both now. That night, as the storm finally broke, Emily and Nathan sat by the fire, exhausted but steady. The passage stood outside, unremarkable in appearance, extraordinary in function. It had done what it was meant to do. It had carried them through the worst of winter, without demanding courage, only preparation. Emily looked at her son, his face lit by firelight, no longer tight with fear. The bridge they had finished was not just a structure. It was a promise kept, a line drawn between exposure and safety. And winter, for the first time since their arrival, no longer felt like an enemy without answer. Spring did not announce itself with warmth. It arrived first as restraint. The cold loosened its grip slowly, reluctantly, as if testing whether it might be allowed to stay. Snow softened before it disappeared, its hard edges rounding under pale sunlight. Drifts sank into themselves, revealing ground that had not been seen for months. The creek swelled with meltwater, its sound growing louder and more insistent, a reminder that movement had resumed even if comfort had not yet returned. Emily noticed the change one morning when she stepped into the passage and felt something unfamiliar beneath her boots. Dry wood. Not frozen. Not brittle. The structure held the night's cold without amplifying it, and the air inside carried a faint trace of moisture that no longer threatened to turn to ice. She stood there longer than necessary, listening to the forest wake in stages, birds returning cautiously, the wind no longer cutting, but wandering. Nathan emerged behind her, yawning, wrapped in a jacket that was already too small for him. He leaned against the railing and looked out at the clearing. "It's quieter," he said. "It's different," Emily answered. She realized that for the first time since arriving, she was not scanning for danger. The habit lingered, but it no longer dominated every thought. They spent the early weeks of spring repairing rather than defending. The roof that had held through winter was checked board by board. Seals were reinforced, where Henry's notes suggested they might weaken over time. The stove was cleaned thoroughly, ash removed, flues inspected. Emily treated maintenance with the seriousness of someone who understood that neglect was simply failure delayed. The passage remained unchanged. It did not need improvement. It had been designed correctly from the beginning. That realization carried its own weight. Not everything required constant refinement. Some things, if thought through carefully enough, simply needed to be respected. With the thaw came paperwork. Emily drove into town again, this time not with urgency but with intention. She met with a clerk who seemed surprised that the property had not been claimed sooner. Records were examined, dates verified. The process was slow but straightforward. The land, forgotten by most, was legally theirs. When Emily signed the final document, the pen felt heavier than it should have. Ownership, she realized, was not relief. It was responsibility made official. Nathan began attending the small school in the nearest town, once the roads cleared enough to make travel reliable. The building was old, the class sizes small, the teachers practical rather than inspiring. It suited him. He came home with stories of projects and questions that reached beyond textbooks. He spoke about weather patterns and geography with a familiarity that surprised Emily. His understanding of the land was no longer theoretical. It was lived. Emily found work she could do remotely, modest at first, then steadier. The income was not large, but it was consistent. More importantly, it did not require her to leave the property for long stretches of time. She worked at the table Henry had built, the passage visible through the window, a constant reminder of why stability here required presence as much as effort. Word traveled slowly in the region, but it traveled. A neighbor several miles away stopped by one afternoon, having seen smoke from the chimney during winter storms, and wondered who lived there now. He walked the passage with visible interest, asked careful questions, nodded often. Others followed. Not many, but enough. People who understood what winter did to distance, who had lost animals, tools, time to exposure they had underestimated. Emily did not present herself as an expert. She shared what she knew, showed what worked, and admitted what she had learned the hard way. The passage spoke for itself. Practical people respected that more than confidence. One evening, as the days lengthened and the air softened, Emily sat alone in the passage and reread Henry's notebooks. She did not skim them now. She read them as a conversation, a continuation rather than an instruction. She understood the places where his handwriting tightened, where calculations grew more cautious. He had built with awareness of failure, not optimism. That awareness had been his strength. She thought about Michael then, not with the sharp pain that had once accompanied his memory, but with a steadier presence. She understood why he had kept this place separate from their previous life. He had seen both the solution and the cost. He had chosen safety for his family in a way that had seemed contradictory at the time. Now it felt consistent. He had trusted that the idea would wait until it was truly needed. Nathan joined her quietly, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall. He was taller now, his movements less tentative. "Do you think Dad knew we'd come here?" he asked. Emily considered the question carefully. "I think he hoped we wouldn't have to," she said. "But he wanted it to be possible if we did." Nathan nodded. He accepted that answer without argument. He had learned that some truths were layered, that understanding came in stages. Summer arrived without ceremony. The forest grew dense and green, obscuring scars left by winter. Repairs shifted toward improvement. Emily cleared more ground for a small garden. Nathan helped build raised beds using leftover lumber. The work was lighter now, less urgent, but no less intentional. Visitors continued to come occasionally. Some asked about the passage specifically. Others simply wanted to understand how Emily and Nathan had managed the winter alone. She answered honestly. Preparation. Respect for the land. An unwillingness to believe that tradition was always correct, simply because it was familiar. By autumn, the passage was no longer remarkable to them. It had become part of daily movement, as ordinary as opening a door. Emily found that this ordinariness was its greatest success. It did not demand attention. It simply worked. When the first cold nights returned, Emily felt no panic. She checked supplies, reviewed Henry's notes again, adjusted where needed. Nathan watched, learned, and asked fewer questions now. He trusted the systems they had put in place. On the anniversary of their arrival, Emily stood at the edge of the clearing and looked back at the structures. The house, the workshop, the passage connecting them. None of it was impressive by conventional standards. There were no grand views, no architectural flourishes, and yet it represented something she had not had in years. Continuity. What remained was not just shelter or security. It was the understanding that survival did not require isolation, only thoughtful connection. That protection did not mean hiding from the world, but shaping the way one moved through it. As winter approached again, Emily felt ready. Not because she believed it would be easy, but because she knew it was manageable. The passage stood between buildings, elevated and quiet, a simple answer to a question that had once seemed overwhelming. And in that answer, she found not just safety, but the beginning of a life that no longer felt like an emergency. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel. More stories like this are coming next. Watch the other videos on the channel. They continue the same themes of survival, choice, and quiet strength. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who might need it too.